Sit down, turn up the volume, and prepare for a reality check. You think the universe is full of horrifying monsters lurking in the dark? Wait until you hear what an advanced alien civilization considers a lethal, uncontainable nightmare, and why one human exchange student couldn't stop laughing at it. High above the azure clouds of Kepler Prime, the Interstellar Academy of Sciences stood as a testament to biological and engineering perfection. Within its crystalline halls, thousands of species converged to study the mysteries of the cosmos. Yet, inside Lecture Theater 4, the atmosphere was far from purely academic. A heavy, palpable dread hung over the multi-species student body. Professor Harrison Carter paced before the massive holographic projector at the front of the amphitheater. Despite his entirely Western moniker, a necessity of the phonetic translation implants issued to all Academy personnel, Carter was not human. He was a tall, slender being of avian descent, possessing sharp features, iridescent plumage beneath a tailored academic coat, and an inherently nervous disposition honed by a million years of his species being the hunted rather than the hunter. Today, he was concluding his senior-level seminar on xenobiological predation, a course specifically designed to teach civilized species how to identify and survive the universe's most dangerous fauna. Fear, Professor Carter stated, his voice carrying a slight synthesized echo through the acoustic dampeners, is not merely an emotion, it is a biological imperative. It is an evolutionary alarm bell that has kept our respective ancestors alive long enough to develop spaceflight, poetry, and quantum mechanics. He tapped a control on his podium, and a massive, complex chart materialized in the air, glowing with severe red and orange hues. Today, we are discussing auditory intimidation, the vocal terror scale. Across the known galaxy, apex predators rely on specific frequencies to paralyze their prey before the strike. Sub-audible infrasound to disorient the inner ear. High-frequency shrieks to overload the nervous system. We are going to analyze a recently declassified audio file obtained by a planetary survey drone on a Level 9 restricted deathworld. In the third row, Beulah Harper sat with her datapad glowing softly. Like Carter, her translated name belied her alien physiology. She belonged to a mammalian analog species known for their hypersensitive hearing and fragile bone structures. Beulah was a brilliant student, but she was visibly trembling. Her large, tufted ears swiveled back and forth, trying to catch every nuance of Carter's warning. A few rows behind Beulah, leaning back in a chair clearly not designed for his skeletal structure, was Alexander Cole. Alexander was an anomaly at the Academy. As an engineering student from Earth, a planet recently integrated into the interstellar community and widely regarded as a chaotic, terrifying mudball, he was only taking xenobiology to fulfill a generalized science credit required for his degree. He was currently balancing a stylus on his index finger, staring blankly at the ceiling, his mind drifting to the internship application he had just submitted to Boston Dynamics back on Earth. He missed terrestrial gravity. He missed real coffee. Most of all, he was deeply bored by the Academy's obsession with classifying every minor threat in the galaxy as an apocalyptic terror. "I must caution you all," Professor Carter announced, his tone shifting into grave seriousness. He initiated a sequence on his console, causing heavy acoustic shielding panels to slide over the lecture hall's doors. The ambient lighting dimmed to a clinical, sterile white. The entity you are about to hear is classified as an apex macro predator, though its exact size is heavily debated by the survey team. What is undisputed is its lethality. The drone recorded this creature engaging in a territorial display. Its vocalizations contain a terrifying duality. A low-frequency rumbling designed to liquefy the resolve of its prey, followed by an aggressive, high-decibel spike intended to stun the central nervous system. Beulah whimpered softly, adjusting her ocular lenses. Next to her, a reptilian student named Gregory tightened his grip on his desk, his scales turning a pale shade of gray in anticipation. "Medical drones are on standby outside the hall," Carter added gently. "If the frequency causes auditory hemorrhaging or triggers a paralytic shock response, remain in your seats. Do not attempt to flee, as sudden movements may exacerbate the physiological panic cascade." Alexander finally stopped balancing his stylus. He sat up, running a hand through his dark hair, genuinely curious for the first time all semester. Earth's classification as a deathworld was a running joke among his human peers, but he hadn't yet seen what the broader galaxy considered genuinely terrifying. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands, waiting for the horrifying roar of some alien leviathan. Carter took a deep breath, smoothing his plumage, and pressed the playback icon on the central console. Complete silence dominated the lecture hall for exactly 2 seconds. Then the sound began. It did not start with a roar. It began as a rhythmic, guttural vibration. Rrr, rumble, rrr, rumble, rrr, rumble. The sound was incredibly deep, an oscillating motor of flesh and air that seemed to bypass the students' eardrums and resonate directly within their chest cavities. Panic rippled through the amphitheater instantly. To the alien physiology, this was the acoustic signature of impending doom. It was the sound of a creature so large, so confident in its absolute supremacy, that it didn't even bother to mask its approach. The infrasonic qualities of the recording caused the water in the students' drinking containers to ripple violently. Beulah gasped, clapping her hands over her ears, tears welling in her large, sensitive eyes. Her heart rate monitor, visible on her uniform's lapel, began to flash a dangerous yellow. Gregory, the reptilian student, had completely frozen, his biological systems shutting down into a hardwired survival state of tonic immobility. Professor Carter stood behind his reinforced podium, his avian eyes darting nervously. "Note the oscillation," he shouted over the vibrating hum, trying to maintain his academic composure. The predator is practically vibrating the surrounding air to disorient the prey's spatial awareness. Then the recording shifted. The rhythmic rumbling cut off abruptly, replaced by a sharp, sudden intake of breath, followed immediately by an ear-piercing, demonic wail. Meow-o-o, meow-o-o, VMSSSSS. The screech was visceral, ending in a violent, wet hissing sound that crackled with raw, unadulterated aggression. It was the sound of a beast, promising absolute, bloody destruction. Half the class dropped to the floor. Beulah vanished beneath her desk entirely, curling into a tight, trembling ball. A few students near the front row outright fainted, their biological failsafes tripping to save their minds from the sheer terror of the noise. Carter staggered back, gripping the edge of the holographic table, his breathing shallow and rapid. He hurriedly slammed his hand down on the emergency stop button. The recording cut out. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening, broken only by the whimpering of terrified alien students and the mechanical hum of the ventilation system. Carter leaned over the podium, panting. "Fascinating," he croaked, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Utterly horrifying, but fascinating. The psychological devastation is almost instantaneous. Survey data suggests this creature possesses retractable claws capable of shearing through natural armor, and a jaw mechanism optimized for severing spinal cords in a single bite. The survey drone was destroyed shortly after transmitting this file. We can only assume the beast detected its electromagnetic signature and eradicated it out of sheer malice. In the back row, a strange, suffocated sound echoed in the quiet room. Carter's head snapped up. His sharp eyes scanned the terrified faces of his students, eventually landing on the human in the back. Alexander Cole was slumped over his desk, his face buried in his arms. His shoulders were shaking violently. He was making a series of bizarre, rhythmic, gasping noises. "Mr. Cole," Carter barked, instantly concerned. "Are you experiencing a neurorespiratory failure? I warned you about the acoustic shock. Medical drones, deploy to sector." No, wait," Alexander choked out, raising one hand weakly into the air while keeping his face hidden. He took a massive, shuddering breath and slowly lifted his head. His face was bright red. Tears were streaming from his eyes. But he wasn't crying from terror. He was laughing. He was laughing so hard, no sound was coming out. The entire class stared at him in stunned silence. Beulah peeked out from under her desk, her large ears twitching in confusion. Gregory unthawed just enough to blink his inner eyelids at the bizarre spectacle. Alexander wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, letting out a heavy sigh as he tried to regain his composure. He looked down at the professor, a massive, irrepressible smirk plastered across his face. "Professor Carter," Alexander said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. Please tell me you didn't just classify that thing as a level 9 macro predator. Carter bristled, deeply offended by the human's complete lack of academic decorum. I assure you, Mr. Cole, there is nothing humorous about this data. The creature that produced this auditory threat is a masterstroke of predatory evolution. It is a remorseless killing machine. Alexander let out a sharp bark of laughter, shaking his head. He leaned back in his chair, resting his boots on the back of the empty seat in front of him. Professor, Alexander said, a smirk dancing on his lips. That's just a house cat. Carter blinked. His translation implant worked flawlessly, but the semantic meaning of the words failed to align with his reality. A what? A house cat, Alexander repeated slowly, enunciating the words as if explaining a simple math problem to a child, scientifically known as Felis catus. Specifically, it sounds like an orange tabby that's extremely pissed off because someone woke it up from a nap. A murmur of confusion rippled through the recovering students. Beulah slowly pulled herself up into her chair, her eyes wide. Alexander, you are saying this. This apex terror is native to your homeworld? Native? Alexander chuckled. Yeah, I guess. But more importantly, it lives in my house. Actually, it lives in about, 50 million houses across Earth. Carter's plumage puffed up in absolute denial. Preposterous! Mr. Cole, I will not tolerate disruptive fabrications in my lecture hall. This creature's acoustic profile indicates a lung capacity and muscle density designed for lethal takedowns. To suggest that humanity allows such a beast to roam freely within your domiciles— Allow? Alexander interrupted, standing up from his desk. He grabbed his datapad and began descending the stairs toward the front of the amphitheater. Professor, we don't just allow them in our houses. We build them little carpeted towers to climb on. We feed them premium seafood from specialized cans. We let them sleep on our faces. The amphitheater descended into absolute, horrified pandemonium. Order! Order in the hall! Professor Carter shouted, banging a metallic gavel against his podium to drown out the panicked shrieks and frantic whispering of the alien students. It took nearly 2 minutes for the room to settle down. Alexander had reached the front of the class. He stood casually beside the massive holographic projector, holding his personal datapad. He looked entirely too comfortable for someone discussing a biological nightmare. Mr. Cole, Carter said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and deep-seated dread. Are you standing before this academic institution and stating, for the record, that humanity actively domesticates a creature capable of producing that paralyzing frequency? First of all, we didn't really domesticate them, Alexander corrected, tapping a few commands into his datapad. Genetic evidence suggests they actually domesticated themselves. They realized human settlements had an abundance of rodents, smaller prey, so they moved in. We thought they were cute, so we let them stay. Thousands of years later, here we are. He plugged his datapad into the auxiliary port of the projector. Second of all, that paralyzing frequency you played? The rumbling one? Alexander tapped a button. That's called purring. It's not an intimidation tactic. They usually do it when they're happy or relaxed or want us to scratch them behind the ears. Actually, studies from Johns Hopkins University back on Earth proved that the frequency of a cat's purr between 25 and 140 hertz has therapeutic properties. It promotes tissue regeneration and bone healing in humans. Beulah let out a soft squeak of absolute bewilderment. It heals you? The predator uses its terror frequency to repair your biological damage? Symbiosis, Alexander said with a grin. We give them food and shelter. Their vibration keeps our bones strong. It's a win-win. Show us, demanded a harsh, synthesized voice from the doorway. The entire class turned. Standing at the entrance of the lecture hall was Inspector Arthur Pendleton. He was a high-ranking official from the Interstellar Quarantine Board, an imposing, heavily armored biped from a militaristic species known for their strict adherence to safety protocols. He had been auditing the university's curriculum, and clearly the commotion had drawn his attention. Pendleton marched down the aisle, his heavy boots clanking against the floor plates. If what you say is true, human, you are admitting to a Level 1 violation of the Interstellar Cohabitation Act. Harboring an apex predator within civilian zones is grounds for immediate planetary quarantine. Alexander rolled his eyes. Oh, relax, Inspector. It's an 8-pound furball, not a xenomorph. You want proof? Fine. Alexander bypassed the university's strict firewall with a few quick engineering tricks he'd learned during his freshman year, mirroring his personal photo gallery onto the massive 50-foot holographic screen at the front of the hall. The image flickered to life. The alien students gasped and leaned back in their chairs. On the screen was a high-definition video of Alexander's living room back in Colorado. Sitting in the middle of a plush rug was an orange tabby cat. It was aggressively grooming its own back leg, completely oblivious to the camera. Everyone, meet Barnaby, Alexander introduced, pointing casually at the 50-foot projection of the feline. Inspector Pendleton stared at the image, his specialized optical sensors scanning the creature's biology. Its forward-facing ocular cavities, binocular vision, optimized for depth perception and tracking fast-moving prey. And the musculature beneath that fur, it is entirely composed of fast-twitch fibers. Oh, absolutely, Alexander agreed enthusiastically, seemingly unaware of the inspector's rising panic. Barnaby's reaction time is roughly 20 to 70 milliseconds. For context, a human's reaction time is about 200 milliseconds. If Barnaby actually wanted to hurt me, he could swipe my eye out before my brain even registered that he moved. Professor Carter swayed on his feet, gripping the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. And the biological armaments? The survey drone reported retractable bone shears on its appendages. Alexander tapped the screen, skipping to the next video. It showed Barnaby playing with a feathered toy on a string, which Alexander's 8-year-old sister was dangling in the air. The cat leaped an astonishing 5 feet vertically, its paws splayed, revealing sharp, curved claws that caught the light, snatching the toy violently out of the air before landing silently on all fours. Several students screamed. Beulah covered her eyes, peeking only through her fingers. The claws, Alexander explained clinically, adopting the tone of a guest lecturer. Made of keratin. Kept razor-sharp because they retract into the paw when not in use, preventing them from dulling on the ground. They use them for climbing, gripping prey, and occasionally shredding our living room furniture when they get bored. Pendleton's translation collar buzzed with static as he tried to process the information. You allow your offspring to engage in mock combat. With a bioweapon that has a reaction time triple your own? It's called playing, Inspector, Alexander said, pulling up another slide. This one displayed a cross-section of a cat's skull provided by the Smithsonian Institution's zoology database. But wait, it gets better. You mentioned their bite force earlier, Professor? You were right. Their jaws are specifically evolved to slip between the vertebrae of their prey and sever the spinal cord in a single bite. Plus, their saliva is packed with bacteria, including Pastorella multocida. If a cat bites you deeply and you don't get antibiotics, the infection can cause severe sepsis within a day. Silence reigned in the room once more. It was a thick, suffocating silence. The aliens were looking at Alexander not just as a student from a deathworld, but as a creature of absolute, incomprehensible insanity. Let me summarize, Inspector Pendleton finally said, his voice devoid of all emotion, a stark indicator of his absolute horror. Your species willingly takes a predator equipped with hyper-reflexes, armor-piercing retractable claws, flesh-tearing teeth, and biologically toxic saliva, and you lock it inside your primary sleeping quarters. Yep, Alexander smiled. Sometimes they sleep on our chests. If they get a nightmare, they might accidentally claw you, but you just pat their head and go back to sleep. Pendleton turned slowly to Professor Carter. Shut down the projector. I am contacting the High Council. The human homeworld must be locked behind a class. 4 blockade immediately. If these creatures escape into the broader galactic ecosystem, the casualty rate would be incalculable. Alexander's smirk faded, realizing his attempt to show off was suddenly spiraling into an interstellar diplomatic incident that could ruin Earth's standing in the galaxy. He had to pivot and he had to do it fast. "Inspector, wait," Alexander said, his voice dropping the playful sarcasm. He stepped squarely in front of the holographic projector, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're missing the point of why humanity keeps them. You're looking at Barnaby like he's a monster. But you don't understand the ecosystem we evolved in." Alexander pulled up a final image. It wasn't a picture of a cat. It was a historical composite image of early human agriculture, depicting massive stone silos filled with grain, surrounded by thousands of dark, scurrying shapes. 10,000 years ago, humanity figured out how to farm. Alexander spoke softly, addressing the entire room. "We grew wheat. We stored it. But our world is a death world, Inspector. And on a death world, whenever there is an abundance of food, the parasites come." He zoomed in on the dark shapes. Rats. Thousands of them. Rodents. They ate our food, they destroyed our crops, and worse, they carried plagues. A specific bacterial infection carried by the fleas on these rodents, the bubonic plague, wiped out roughly 50 million humans in a single century. That was 1/3 of our entire population on the European continent. The alien students gasped. To them, a plague of that magnitude was an extinction-level event. "We were dying," Alexander stated grimly, his eyes locking onto Pendleton's. "We were losing a war against a biological threat we couldn't even see properly, let alone fight. And then, out of the deserts, these horrifying predators walked into our settlements." Alexander pointed back to a picture of a wild feline sitting atop a grain silo, a dead rat hanging from its jaws. "The cats didn't hunt us. They hunted the things that were killing us. They guarded our food supplies, they killed the disease carriers, they patrolled our homes while we slept. They were an invasive species, sure, but they were our invasive species. We didn't conquer the cats, Inspector. We formed a military alliance with them." Alexander lowered his datapad, letting the image of the feline sentinel glow warmly in the darkened lecture hall. "So yes, Barnaby is an apex predator. Yes, he's a highly evolved killing machine with toxic spit and razor blades in his hands. But he is also a decorated veteran of the human survival effort. They earned their spot on our couches. And if the interstellar community thinks they can quarantine Earth because we honor our ancient treaties with the animals that saved our species, well, I'd like to see you try and tell Barnaby he's not allowed to sleep on my bed." Silence settled heavily over Lecture Theater 4, thick enough to be cut with a standard-issue plasma cutter. The holographic image of the ancient feline sitting triumphantly atop a stone silo bathed the amphitheater in a soft, golden light. Inspector Arthur Pendleton stared at the projection, his armored chest heaving as his internal processors worked overtime to reconcile standard galactic safety protocols with the brutal, pragmatic logic of Earth's evolutionary history. His species, the Vexillians, had conquered their homeworld through methodical engineering and the eradication of all hostile fauna. The concept of inviting a lethal predator into one's inner sanctum to deal with a lesser threat was not just alien. It bordered on psychological insanity. "You speak of ancient history, human," Pendleton said, his synthesized voice dropping an octave, losing its sharp edge of authority and replacing it with genuine, cautious curiosity. "But the data Professor Carter presented is modern. You maintain this. This military alliance, even though your species has achieved spaceflight? Surely, your current agricultural and architectural technologies have rendered rodent infestations obsolete. Why keep the bioweapons in your sleeping quarters now?" Alexander leaned against the holographic projector, crossing his arms casually. "Because loyalty goes both ways, Inspector. You don't abandon your veterans when the war is over. Plus, the psychological benefits I mentioned earlier are documented fact. If you look at the research of Dr. John Bradshaw, an anthrozoologist from the University of Bristol back on Earth, his structural analysis of feline behavior proves something incredible. Cats don't view humans as their masters. They don't see us as a separate species ruling over them. Their neurochemical responses indicate they view us as a larger, slightly clumsy, and relatively hairless breed of fellow cats." Beulah Harper let out a tiny, high-pitched gasp from the third row. Her large ears twitched rapidly. "They think you are one of them? A giant, hairless apex predator?" "Exactly," Alexander smiled, pointing a finger at Beulah in affirmation. They bring us dead mice or toys because they think we're terrible hunters and they're trying to teach us how to survive. They groom us to show affection within the pack hierarchy. We aren't their owners. We're their family. Professor Carter stepped out from behind his reinforced podium, his iridescent plumage still slightly ruffled from the audio recording. Mr. Cole, while this sociological data is fascinating, it does not change the physical reality. You are a deathworlder. Your physiology has adapted to survive alongside these creatures. The rest of the galaxy has not. The Quarantine Board's primary directive is to prevent cross-contamination of Apex. A shrill, deafening klaxon suddenly ripped through the lecture hall, instantly drowning out Carter's lecture. The clinical white lights of the amphitheater flashed violently to a deep, pulsing crimson. The heavy acoustic shielding panels that had been closed for the audio demonstration locked into place with a series of heavy, magnetic thuds, sealing the doors completely. An automated, emotionless voice resonated from the ceiling speakers. Code Crimson. Code Crimson. Biological containment failure in Xenobiology Laboratory 3. An adult Xylothian spine crawler has breached its stasis pod. Level 4 lockdown initiated. All personnel remain in secured areas until armed security arrives. Panic did not slowly build in the room. It exploded instantly. Alien students screamed in terror, scrambling over their desks, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the ventilation grates as possible. Professor Carter practically threw himself backward, taking cover behind his podium, his avian instincts driving him to seek shelter. Alexander stood confused, looking at the ceiling. A what? What's a Xylothian spine crawler? Pendleton drew a heavy, brutal-looking plasma sidearm from his hip holster, his optical sensors whirring as they scanned the ceiling. It is a silicon-based parasite from the outer rim, Pendleton barked, his voice tight with genuine fear. It possesses a neurotoxic stinger capable of paralyzing an adult Vexillion in seconds. It seeks out heat signatures to lay its larva. It is entirely resistant to standard energy barriers because of its crystalline exoskeleton. Get back, human! If it enters this room, standard reflexes will not be fast enough to stop it. Alexander frowned, realizing the gravity of the situation. He backed away from the projector, moving toward his desk where his heavy canvas messenger bag sat resting on the floor. Before he could reach it, the heavy metal grating of the primary ventilation shaft above the third row buckled. The bolts groaned under immense pressure, and with a sickening crunch, the grate gave way, crashing onto a desk just 2 feet away from Beulah Harper. Out of the dark shaft slithered a nightmare. The Xylothian spine crawler was nearly 3 feet long, resembling a heavily armored centipede made of jagged, obsidian-like glass. It had dozens of razor-sharp, multi-jointed legs that clicked horrifyingly against the floor plates. At its front, a pair of massive, wicked mandibles dripped with a glowing, corrosive green fluid. Beulah shrieked, paralyzed by terror, unable to move her legs as the creature locked its primary sensory organs directly onto her thermal signature. Pendleton raised his plasma pistol, his hands shaking slightly. Clear the line of fire. I cannot get a target lock. Its erratic movement algorithm is confusing my targeting sensors. The spine crawler hissed a wet, raspy sound and coiled its segmented body backward like a spring, preparing to launch itself directly at Beulah's face. Hey! Alexander shouted, diving toward his desk. He didn't grab a weapon. He grabbed his heavy canvas messenger bag. Under Section 4, Paragraph B of the Interstellar Medical Disability Act, exchange students from high-gravity deathworlds were permitted a singular biological emotional support organism to stave off the psychological deterioration caused by the sterile, hyper-regulated environment of space stations. Alexander had exploited that bureaucratic loophole to its absolute limit. He yanked the heavy zipper open. "Barnaby, you're up!" Alexander yelled, dumping the bag onto the floor. Out of the bag spilled a 12-pound, aggressively orange tabby cat. Barnaby hit the floor gracefully, instantly righting himself. He had been comfortably asleep in the climate-controlled carrier for the last 2 hours, and he looked incredibly annoyed at being rudely awakened. He stretched his front legs outward, extending his claws into the synthetic flooring with a soft scratching sound, and let out a long, jaw-cracking yawn that displayed his sharp canine teeth. The alien students who weren't already screaming at the spine crawler began screaming at the sudden appearance of the literal apex terror they had just spent an hour learning about. "Human!" Pendleton roared, aiming his weapon frantically between the giant, venomous centipede and the orange feline. "Have you lost your mind? You brought the beast into a civilian zone?" Barnaby didn't look at the screaming students. He didn't look at Pendleton's plasma gun. His forward-facing ocular cavities snapped directly toward the hissing, armored alien parasite. The Xylothian spine crawler registered the new thermal signature. Assessing the cat as an immediate threat, the parasite abandoned its strike on Beulah and whipped around, launching its 3-foot-long body through the air directly at Barnaby, its toxic mandibles snapping wide open to deliver a lethal dose of neurotoxin. Pendleton fired. The plasma bolt missed entirely, scorching the wall as the parasite moved too fast for the Vexillion to track. But it didn't move too fast for a deathworlder. To the alien students, the next 2 seconds were a blur of impossible physics. To Barnaby, it was Tuesday. The cat didn't retreat. He didn't even adopt a defensive posture. In a display of raw, terrifying, fast-twitch muscle superiority, Barnaby executed a vertical leap that defied the artificial gravity of the room. He twisted midair, a maneuver of perfect kinetic alignment. Whack! Barnaby's right paw, claws fully extended, struck the armored parasite squarely in the side of its head while it was still airborne. The sheer blunt force trauma of the blow sent the 3-foot alien nightmare spinning wildly off course. It crashed hard against a desk, its crystalline armor cracking under the impact. "By the ancestors," Carter whispered from behind his podium, his avian eyes wide in absolute disbelief. The reaction time. It intercepted a mid-air strike. The spine crawler scrambled to recover, furiously clicking its dozens of legs to right itself. It hissed violently, spraying a drop of green acid that sizzled against the floor. It charged Barnaby, moving in a terrifying, zigzagging pattern designed to confuse visual tracking. Barnaby's pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black pools of focused lethality. His tail flicked once to the left, acting as a counterbalance. As the parasite lunged again, bringing its stinger over its back like a scorpion, Barnaby simply sidestepped. He moved with a liquid grace that mocked the mechanical, frantic aggression of the alien bug. As the stinger passed harmlessly by his ear, Barnaby's jaws opened. With surgical precision, the feline clamped his teeth down on the exact joint behind the creature's armored head, the biological equivalent of a spinal column. The crunch was loud enough to be heard over the station's blaring alarms. The Xylothian spine crawler thrashed violently for exactly 1 second. Then, Barnaby applied a sudden, brutal jerk of his neck. Another sickening pop echoed through the lecture hall. The parasite went completely limp, its dozens of legs curling inward as its central nerve cluster was severed instantly. Complete, absolute silence slammed back into the room, broken only by the flashing crimson lights of the alarm system. Barnaby stood over the corpse of the lethal alien terror. He sniffed the shattered exoskeleton once, seemingly disgusted by the smell of silicon-based blood, and released the carcass from his jaws. He sat down right next to the dead monster, lifted his right hind leg, and casually began to groom his tail, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just neutralized a galactic-level threat. Pendleton stood frozen, his plasma pistol still raised, his jaw slightly open beneath his tactical helmet. Beulah Harper, still trembling on her chair, slowly lowered her hands from her face. She looked at the dead parasite, then looked at the orange cat who was now licking his paw and wiping it over his ear. It killed it," Beulah whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of raw awe and lingering terror. The drone recording didn't do it justice. It just played with it. Alexander walked calmly over to the center of the room. He reached down and scratched Barnaby firmly behind the ears. "Good boy," Alexander cooed. Immediately, the sound began. Rumble, rumble, rumb, rumb, rumb. The deep, oscillating vibration filled the room. But this time, nobody fainted. Nobody dove under their desks. As the aliens listened to the low-frequency hum, they didn't hear the terrifying war drum of a merciless killer. They heard the engine of a protector. They heard the sound of an ancient alliance, a biological machine that had just saved their lives because it considered the human in the room to be family. Professor Carter slowly stood up, brushing off his academic coat. He adjusted his glasses, staring down at the orange tabby. Mr. Cole, did you illegally smuggle a level 9 macro predator onto an academic space station? Alexander pulled a laminated card from his pocket and held it up with a smug grin. Biological Emotional Support Organism, Professor. Officially registered and approved by the station's medical board. The paperwork is entirely airtight. Pendleton finally lowered his weapon, engaging the safety lock with a sharp click. He walked slowly down the stairs, his heavy boots making no sound against the absolute quiet of the student body. He stopped 3 feet away from Barnaby. Barnaby stopped purring, looked up at the towering, armored Vexillian inspector, and let out a soft, high-pitched noise. Meow. Pendleton stared at the creature for a long, calculating moment. Then, he reached to his tactical belt, unclipped his formal quarantine enforcement datapad, and accessed the primary biological threat registry of the Interstellar Council. Inspector? Carter asked nervously. What are you doing? Are you initiating the class 4 blockade on Earth? I am updating the registry, Pendleton said, his voice entirely serious. He typed rapidly into the glowing screen. Species. Felis catus. Threat level downgraded from level 9, Apex, Macro Predator. Upgraded to class. 1 Guardian Symbiote. Furthermore, I am recommending a mandate that all interstellar agricultural freighters be equipped with no less than 2 of these organisms to prevent parasitic boarding actions. Pendleton looked down at Alexander, giving the human a rare, respectful nod. You humans are chaotic, unpredictable, and frankly terrifying, Pendleton stated, sliding his datapad back into its holster. But your tactical logic is flawless. The alliance holds. Alexander grinned, bending down to scoop Barnaby into his arms. The cat immediately nestled his chin against Alexander's shoulder, continuing his rhythmic rumbling purr, vibrating gently against the human's chest. Yeah. Alexander laughed softly, turning to carry his cat back up the stairs toward his desk. The alliance holds. Come on, Barnaby, let's go get you some premium tuna. If you loved this story about the terrifying power of human alliances and the undisputed supremacy of house cats, don't forget to smash that like button. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY tales where humanity proves that we might be from a death world, but we bring the best pets to the stars. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload.